Farming changed forever when Henry Ford built a machine that didn't just pull, it empowered. For decades, Ford tractors were the backbone of fields across the world. But then, one day they were gone. So why did the company that revolutionized farming step away from it? This is the reason Ford quit making tractors. Chapter 1. The birth of the Fordson. Long before the Ford name was tied to trucks and Super Duty diesels, it was already reshaping something far more essential: the farm. At a time when most American fields were still plowed by horses and harvests came at the cost of physical exhaustion, Ford built a machine that changed the rules. It wasn't designed for show, it was built to work, and for the first time, real horsepower didn't need hay or rest. That machine was the Fordson Model F, and in the year 1917, it rolled off the line as the first mass-produced tractor in history. The timing couldn't have been better. War had drained rural labor. Equipment was either too bulky, too expensive, or too complicated to keep running without a full-time mechanic. Farmers needed something different, something they could afford, fix, and trust. Henry Ford's answer wasn't just another machine. It was a blueprint for how modern agriculture would operate for the next 100 years. The Model F didn't try to outmuscle the giants of the day. It didn't have towering wheels or oversized castings. What it had was simplicity: a 4-cylinder gasoline engine producing around 20 horsepower, backed by a displacement of roughly 2,100 cubic centimeters, or about 128 cubic inches. It was compact, easy to handle, and even easier to maintain. Most owners didn't need special tools. A wrench, some oil, and a clean rag got you through most repairs. But the real breakthrough wasn't under the hood. It was how the whole machine was built. Ford used the same production methods that made the Model T famous: assembly lines, interchangeable parts, and aggressive pricing. That meant a Fordson could be delivered to a farm for less than half the cost of competing tractors. For many families, it was their first motorized machine, even before they owned a car, and that changed everything. Once it hit the market, the Fordson spread fast. By the early 1920s, it was the most common tractor in North America, and it didn't stop there. Shipments moved overseas to the United Kingdom, where food shortages made efficiency critical, to the Soviet Union, where entire fields were reclaimed using fleets of Fordsons, and to Australia, where their lightweight frames made them ideal for open wheat farms. This wasn't just an American tool anymore. It was a global movement. The numbers tell the story. By the time production shifted in 1928, more than 750,000 Fordson units had been sold worldwide. No tractor had ever come close. In towns where farming meant survival, the sight of a Fordson in the field was more than familiar. It was a sign that the farm had a future, and in rural America, that mattered. There was no luxury in the design, no cab, no power steering, just 3 forward gears, a steel frame, and the sound of combustion cutting through morning silence. But what it lacked in comfort, it delivered in uptime. It could run belt-driven equipment, pull steel plows, and survive rough winters with minimal downtime. Even when parked in a barn corner for years, most Fordsons would fire back to life with a little attention and fuel. That kind of resilience wasn't common. Not then, not now. Competition didn't know how to respond. Larger manufacturers tried to match Ford's price, but without his factory scale, it never worked. Others pushed bigger engines or heavier designs, but that missed the point. The Model F wasn't built to impress dealers. It was built to get crops in and out of the ground. That purpose-first design made it one of the most important diesel-to-gasoline transition tractors of the early 20th century. Even though its own engine ran on gasoline, it cleared the path for diesel adoption later, and that mattered more than specs ever could. The Model F showed farmers they didn't have to choose between affordability and performance. They could have both. They didn't need to rent or borrow equipment from neighbors. They didn't need animals to pull every implement. They could take control, not just of the land, but of the work itself. Over the years, the Fordson gained a reputation that went beyond reliability. It became personal. Farmers didn't just use them, they relied on them, passed them down, and in many cases, never got rid of them. Even today, some still sit in sheds or behind barns, not forgotten, just resting. Because when a machine helps feed a family for 3 generations, it earns a different kind of respect. Ford didn't set out to dominate the tractor market. He set out to free the farmer from dependence on animals, on expensive equipment, on uncertainty. The Fordson was how he did it. And while bigger and better machines would come later, none would shift the direction of agriculture quite the same way. This wasn't just the birth of a new tractor. It was the start of something much larger, a quiet revolution powered by cast iron, cold mornings, and the belief that better tools make better lives. For the millions who climbed aboard a Fordson, that belief wasn't a slogan. It was real, and it was built to last. Chapter 2: The 8N Revolution. But the story didn't end there. 2 decades later, in the aftermath of global war and economic hardship, Ford returned to the field with a machine that would not only build on that legacy, it would redefine it. This was the era of the Ford 8N, a tractor that didn't just carry the weight of tools and implements, but the expectations of an entire generation of farmers looking for something new, something better, and something they could rely on. The road to the 8N began during wartime with the Ford 2N, a stopgap model introduced in the early 1940s to keep American farms moving as the country shifted its industrial base toward defense. It shared much of its architecture with the earlier 9N, but due to wartime restrictions on materials like rubber and aluminum, compromises had to be made. Steel wheels replaced rubber tires, magnetos took the place of batteries, and styling was kept utilitarian. Still, the 2N did its job. It kept food production alive during a time when every bushel counted. But once the war ended, farmers were ready for more. That answer came in the year 1947 with the release of the Ford 8N. This wasn't just a refreshed version of the 2N. It was a full leap forward. And while its shape looked familiar, everything about it had been tuned to meet the needs of a new era. The color scheme changed from the traditional dark gray to a red and light gray two-tone. The transmission now offered 4 forward speeds instead of 3. And more importantly, the clutch, brakes, and control layout had been overhauled for easier use. For operators who had grown up with earlier models, the learning curve was almost non-existent. But for new users, it felt like progress they could feel in their hands. At the heart of the 8N was a 4-cylinder, gasoline-powered engine producing roughly 27 horsepower, with a displacement of just under 2,000 cubic centimeters, or about 122 cubic inches. That output, paired with better gearing and hydraulics, allowed the tractor to manage a wider range of implements than anything Ford had produced before. But raw specs weren't what made the 8N legendary. What did was a single invention bolted to the rear, the revolutionary 3-point hitch system, co-developed by Henry Ford and Irish engineer Harry Ferguson. The concept was simple but powerful. Use the tractor's own weight and hydraulic lift to create a stable, secure connection between the machine and its implement. No more dragging dead weight, no more clumsy hookups. With the 3-point system, the tool became part of the tractor, lifting, lowering, and adjusting with precision. The improvement in safety and efficiency was immediate. Implements could now be changed faster, worked more evenly, and adjusted mid-task without dismounting. Farmers who once struggled with complex belt drives and heavy attachments now found themselves in control of a system that responded like an extension of the operator. That innovation wasn't just technical, it was cultural. The 3-point hitch became the standard across the entire tractor industry. Every major brand followed Ford's lead, and for good reason. It changed how work was done. Ford didn't just build a better tractor. They built a system that raised the bar for everyone. By the early 1950s, the 8N had become the best-selling individual tractor model in North American history. Dealers couldn't keep them on lots. Word of mouth moved faster than advertising. In towns big and small, farmers lined up to see what all the talk was about. The combination of power, ease of use, and unmatched versatility made it the first and last tractor many farms would ever need. And because it was priced within reach, it wasn't a luxury, it was an investment that paid for itself in every season. The 8N didn't just show up in fields, it showed up in black and white ads, grainy newspaper photos, and government demonstration plots. It was featured in rural extension programs, and often parked in front of the county fair's agricultural booth. For a generation of Americans raised on post-war optimism and self-reliance, the 8N symbolized both. It was modern without being complicated, rugged without being clumsy. For farmers who had fought in the war or kept things running back home, it felt like a reward that finally made the work a little easier. Behind the scenes, Ford's global infrastructure was hitting full stride. Massive production lines at the Highland Park and Rouge plants ran around the clock. Parts distribution spanned from small-town dealers to overseas markets. And customer support, a phrase not often used in rural equipment at the time, became part of the experience. If something went wrong, help wasn't far away. That kind of confidence turned customers into loyalists, and loyalists into lifelong brand ambassadors. Ford had built trust, not through gimmicks, but through machines that performed when it mattered most. By the close of the 8N's production run in the year 1952, more than 500,000 units had been sold. But its impact went well beyond numbers. It became a cultural fixture, a machine you could find just as easily on a postage stamp as in a hayfield, and it marked Ford's arrival at the peak of its agricultural power. No longer just the company that brought mechanization to the masses, Ford had become the standard by which others were measured. The 8N didn't just carry the Ford name, it carried a legacy of innovation, independence, and trust. And for a while, it looked like nothing could slow it down. The story behind Ford's tractors is just getting started. From bold designs to boardroom decisions, there's more ahead than most realize. Stay with us. Hit like if you're learning something new, and subscribe for the rest of the story. Chapter 3: The 1000 Series and the Global Market. But even legends don't stand still forever. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, farming itself began to change. Fields were getting larger, implements heavier, and farmers demanded more than just reliability. They wanted power, comfort, and machines that could handle modern workloads without slowing down. For Ford, the success of the 8N was now history. The future belonged to a new kind of tractor, one that could take everything the post-war generation had built and push it further. And so began the rise of the Ford 1000 series, a lineup built to meet the rising pressure of global agriculture, and one that would show just how far the brand could go before the pace of innovation caught up. This new series didn't appear all at once. It started with models like the Ford 3000 and Ford 4000, introduced in the early 1960s, each one marking a shift from simple gasoline tractors to more powerful diesel-based designs. These weren't just upgraded engines. They were new machines built around the changing needs of farmers across the world. Power jumped significantly. Engines now ranged from around 2,600 cubic centimeters, or roughly 159 cubic inches, up to 4,200 cubic centimeters, which equals about 256 cubic inches, delivering horsepower numbers between 35 and 90, depending on the model and configuration. But numbers alone didn't define the 1000 series. What set these machines apart was how they brought together strength and usability. Ford understood that the farm had become a more demanding place. The days of open air, metal seats, and long hours without rest were giving way to enclosed cabs, improved hydraulics, and a serious push for operator comfort. With this generation of tractors, Ford introduced more spacious cabins, better ventilation, and clearer control layouts. The machines were easier to live with, not just to drive, but to depend on through long harvest days and late-night planting. That usability extended into the mechanics. Power hydraulics became standard across many models, allowing operators to lift, tilt, and adjust implements with the kind of precision that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Transmission options improved. Hitching systems became more intuitive. And for the first time, these tractors felt less like rigid machines and more like integrated tools. Whether you were cutting hay, dissing fields, or pulling silage wagons, the 1000 series made it all feel smoother and more responsive. Ford wasn't just building for the US anymore either. These tractors were designed with a global market in mind. Manufacturing expanded into Belgium and Brazil, while a new facility in Basildon, United Kingdom, became one of Ford's key hubs for international production. The idea was simple: make a tractor that could thrive anywhere, on the wet hills of Wales, the dry plains of Australia, or the soybean fields of the American Midwest. And for a while, that approach worked. Dealerships followed. Ford invested heavily in building a worldwide service and parts network that could keep machines running no matter how remote the farm. In many areas, the Ford name wasn't just associated with trucks or cars. It became synonymous with tractors that showed up when others didn't. Customers weren't buying marketing, they were buying machines that performed. But the world wasn't standing still. As the 1970s arrived, competition was beginning to accelerate. John Deere introduced advanced hydraulics and integrated operator controls that reshaped how a tractor felt behind the wheel. Massey Ferguson leaned into high-torque diesel engines that delivered raw pulling power across a wider RPM range. International Harvester, now consolidated into Case 1H, focused on ruggedness and versatility backed by decades of field experience. Each of these companies brought something sharp to the table, and each one was moving fast. Ford, by comparison, was still competitive, but not always first. The 1000 series tractors were strong, efficient, and capable, but innovation was becoming the new currency, and Ford's pace was steady rather than aggressive. In a world where technology was shifting toward electronics, digital controls, and automation, Ford's design still leaned on proven mechanical systems. That wasn't a flaw. Many farmers preferred it, but it marked the beginning of a gap between what Ford was building and where the market was going. And yet, for all the pressure, the 1000 series tractors still earned their place in the field. They were dependable, balanced, and versatile enough to handle a wide range of jobs without becoming overcomplicated. In a time when some machines felt more like prototypes than tools, Ford's lineup gave farmers something they could actually use, day in and day out. It was innovation, yes, but grounded in practicality. Still, as demand for electronics, cab comfort, and integrated farming systems grew, the cracks began to show. Ford's global strategy was solid. Its machines were reliable. But in the race to stay ahead, reliability alone was no longer enough. The market was speeding up, and for the first time in decades, Ford was no longer setting the pace. Chapter 4. The Turning Point. But steady wasn't going to be enough. By the late 1970s, the ground beneath global agriculture had started to shift. The world was in the middle of a fuel crisis. Raw material costs were climbing, and inflation was eating away at the margins of farmers and manufacturers alike. For companies like Ford, the pressure wasn't just mechanical anymore, it was financial. And the question looming inside the company wasn't how to build the next great tractor. It was whether building tractors still made sense at all. Across the Farm Belt, sales began to slow. Farmers who had once upgraded machines every few years were now holding on longer. Credit was tighter. Weather cycles grew more unpredictable. And while the demand for food never disappeared, the demand for new equipment became harder to predict. Tractors were still essential, but buying one had become a risk, not a routine. At the same time, the expectations for what a tractor should be were rising fast. Operators wanted enclosed cabs, air conditioning, hydraulic remotes, adjustable suspension seats, and power everything. More importantly, they wanted electronics, from digital gauges to onboard control systems that could manage fuel delivery, monitor performance, and even assist with field work. Adding those features wasn't impossible, but it wasn't cheap. Ford now found itself in a difficult position. Keeping up with the latest tech meant pouring millions into research and development. New engines, cleaner emissions, updated wiring harnesses, smarter hydraulics, and more refined cabins. It also meant redesigning factories, training service networks, and rewriting the very playbook Ford had used to dominate the market since the days of the Model F. That kind of reinvestment required full commitment, and in the late 1970s, commitment was in short supply. Internally, the Ford Motor Company was no longer just a farm and auto manufacturer. It had become a sprawling industrial group, spread across automotive, finance, electronics, aerospace, defense, and even communication systems. Each of those divisions had their own growth demands, their own investment cycles, and their own forecasts. Tractors, by comparison, had begun to look like the slowest path forward. While Ford trucks were breaking sales records and finance arms were expanding into new consumer credit markets, the agricultural equipment division was working harder just to break even. Executives took notice, and slowly the company's focus began to pivot. Top-level leadership looked at the cost of competing in modern agriculture, the slim margins, the global supply risks, the long lead times, and started to ask hard questions. Was it worth it? Could Ford keep pace with brands like John Deere, which had already begun integrating microprocessor controls and precision farming tools? Or with Massey Ferguson, whose diesel platforms were hitting torque numbers that made even newer Fords feel underpowered on tough ground? The answers were not easy. In meetings, the numbers told one story, but the sentiment in boardrooms told another. In boardrooms, farming no longer looked like the future. It looked like nostalgia. That's how one internal report put it. Tractors weren't the problem, they were the past. And for a company trying to stake its future on global expansion, high-margin vehicles, and aerospace ventures, sentiment didn't count for much. None of this meant that Ford tractors were failing in the field. Models like the Ford 7600, with its 4,200 cubic centimeters, or roughly 256 cubic inches diesel engine, were still putting in hard hours on row crops, hayfields, and dairy operations across the country. These were strong, capable machines. But the question was no longer just about capability. It was about future viability. Was Ford ready to double down on ag equipment and match the tech curve? Or was it time to find another way forward? By the early 1980s, that decision began to take shape. Ford started looking outward, particularly toward Europe, where manufacturers were already experimenting with more compact, electronically advanced designs that blended traditional power with modern precision. Europe wasn't just a market, it was a proving ground. And if Ford couldn't stay ahead alone, maybe it could partner with someone who could. The tractors were still running, the dealers were still open. But behind the scenes, a strategic retreat had begun. Not a collapse, but a recalibration. Ford wasn't giving up just yet, but the message was clear. The path forward wouldn't look like the past, and to survive, something had to change. Chapter 5. The New Holland Merger. What began as hesitation in the boardroom soon turned into action on the ground. By the mid-1980s, Ford had made its decision. The tractor business wasn't going to be abandoned, at least not yet, but going it alone was no longer the strategy. The company needed modern technology, fresh momentum, and a broader international footprint. And rather than build all of it from scratch, Ford looked overseas for a partner. In the year 1986, that search led to a bold acquisition, New Holland. At the time, New Holland was already a well-established player in the agricultural sector, especially in Europe. Known for its advanced hydraulics, compact engineering, and efficient harvesting systems, it had exactly what Ford lacked: modern design language and a strong presence outside the United States. Ford, on the other hand, brought durability, name recognition, and one of the largest dealer networks in North America. On paper, it was a perfect match. The goal was simple: blend American toughness with European precision and build a new generation of tractors that could compete on a global scale. Together, the two companies launched a fresh wave of machines that aimed to bridge the old with the new. One of the standouts during this phase was the Ford TW series, a tractor that held on to traditional size and strength but introduced smarter systems under the hood. With a diesel engine measuring 6.6 liters, or roughly 401 cubic inches, the TW series could push close to 150 horsepower, delivering serious pulling strength while integrating New Holland's more refined hydraulics and operator controls. For large-scale operations, especially in grain and row crop production, these machines brought back some of the confidence Ford had started to lose. And for a brief moment, it worked. Farmers responded. The newly branded Ford New Holland line gained traction, not just in the United States, but in Latin America, Australia, and across Europe. The equipment held up well, the technology gaps started to close, and the sense of progress returned. Service centers were modernized. Brochures showed sleek new silhouettes. Cab designs became more ergonomic, and hydraulic performance finally began to match the standards set by competitors. The partnership didn't just feel like a comeback, it looked like one too. But even as the tractors rolled off the line with upgraded features, a different kind of change was happening on the surface. The familiar blue oval that had defined Ford's agricultural identity for decades was slowly being replaced. Bright yellow and blue badges began appearing on hoods and tail panels. Manuals started referring to the company as Ford New Holland, and eventually just New Holland. At first, the shift felt like marketing, but to many farmers, it felt like something deeper, a quiet rebranding that signaled more than just a new paint scheme. The machines still performed, but the connection many farmers felt to the Ford name began to loosen. These weren't the same tractors their fathers had operated. The badge still said Ford, but the spirit was changing. And in rural communities where brand loyalty ran deeper than most business relationships, that shift didn't go unnoticed. Some welcomed the changes, appreciating the technology and added comfort. Others held on to their older machines a little tighter. Internally, Ford was still making moves. The company continued to lean on New Holland's European R&D base, funneling more of the engineering process through Belgium and the United Kingdom. Field tests were conducted across multiple continents. Marketing focused less on legacy and more on functionality. The goal wasn't to preserve history, it was to secure future market share. And behind the improved performance and sleeker designs, the foundation was quietly shifting. From the outside, it looked like Ford was doubling down, but inside, priorities were being reevaluated. The merger had given Ford a second wind in the tractor business, but it had also opened the door to something else, a potential exit. The infrastructure was there. The dealer networks were ready. And now, with the Ford name slowly stepping back, the company had built the perfect platform to step away without breaking everything apart. For now, the tractors were still blue, the engines still ran strong, and the fields still echoed with the sound of Ford diesel power. But behind the decals and performance figures, a bigger plan was already taking shape. This wasn't just a revival, it was a handoff in progress. And soon, the name that had once defined farming innovation would begin to disappear. Chapter 6. The Fiat takeover and the vanishing name. The changes that began with the New Holland merger didn't stop at shared engineering and split branding. By the early 1990s, those changes turned permanent. The tractors were still performing and sales remained steady, but behind the scenes, a much larger shift was underway, one that would bring the end of Ford's identity in the fields altogether. What began as a partnership was now evolving into something else entirely. In the year 1991, Fiat Industrial stepped in and acquired an 80% stake in Ford New Holland. And with that single move, the next chapter of Ford's agricultural history quietly began to close. Fiat was no stranger to tractors. Through its Fiat Agri division, it had spent decades building equipment for European farms, particularly in Italy, France, and Spain. But what it lacked was global reach, especially in North America. Ford, on the other hand, had exactly that: thousands of dealers, brand recognition across generations, and a trusted presence in markets far beyond the US border. The merger made sense. Combine Fiat's production and platform efficiency with Ford's customer base and distribution, and the result was a global powerhouse capable of competing at any scale. From a business perspective, it was the logical next step. The transition wasn't immediate. Ford's name remained on machines through the early part of the decade, particularly on models developed before the acquisition. But gradually, things began to change. By the year 1993, the Ford name had been removed from new tractors entirely. The decals on the hoods no longer read Ford New Holland. Instead, they read either Fiat Agri or simply New Holland, a move that signaled the end of an era without needing to say a word. Models like the 40 Series and 70 Series reflected this new identity. Built using a blend of Ford's platform and Fiat's components, they carried on many of the mechanical strengths farmers had come to expect. Some units still featured engines with displacements over 4,000 cubic centimeters, or more than 244 cubic inches, delivering the same kind of mid-range diesel performance that made earlier Fords popular. But now, those engines sat under cabs that bore no trace of the blue oval. The machines still worked, but for many farmers, they no longer felt like home. The branding change wasn't just about logos. It was about strategy. Fiat's long-term goal was to build a unified global brand, one name, one message, and one streamlined marketing and service network. Consolidating under New Holland made business sense. It simplified support structures, allowed for standardized global parts sourcing, and eliminated internal competition between overlapping labels. Dealers were retrained, brochures were reprinted, and slowly Ford's presence began to fade, not because it had failed, but because the business was evolving faster than its identity could keep up. For farmers, though, the reaction wasn't so simple. For some, the change was just another update, a new badge on a familiar machine, but for others, it was something more personal. Ford tractors had been in their families for generations. The first machine their grandfather bought, the first one they learned to drive, the one that sat in the shed through winters, got pulled out in spring, and never failed to start. It wasn't just about how it ran. It was about what it represented: reliability, independence, and pride. And when the Ford name disappeared, it felt like something irreplaceable went with it. Yet the machines themselves didn't go anywhere. Many of the platforms introduced during the Ford New Holland era continued in production under the C&H umbrella, the result of further mergers that would later bring Case YH and New Holland under the same corporate roof. Under the paint, Ford's engine layouts, hydraulic systems, and chassis configurations remained in service for years. They were updated, refined, and rebranded, but the DNA was still there. The engineering didn't vanish, only the name did. By the mid-1990s, it was clear that the transition was complete. The blue oval no longer appeared on new tractor models. Parts catalogs listed New Holland and Fiat Agri references. Dealerships stopped advertising Ford equipment altogether. The silence around the exit was striking. There was no farewell announcement, no tribute run, no commemorative edition. Just a quiet disappearance, one that left many farmers realizing only later that the legacy they grew up with was already gone. But even as the logos changed, the impact remained. Across fields in North America and beyond, Ford-built machines continued to run, some with decades of work behind them, still pulling, still plowing, still starting on the first turn of the key. Chapter 7. Why Ford Really Quit. The name may have faded from the hoods, but the decision to walk away from tractors was never about failure. By the late 1990s, Ford's quiet exit from agriculture was complete, not with a bang, but with a business plan. What looked from the outside like a loss of direction was, in truth, one of the most calculated and misunderstood pivots in corporate history. Ford didn't collapse in the tractor industry. It stepped away on its own terms, to focus on what it believed mattered most in the century ahead. Internally, the reasoning was clear. Tractors demanded more than just engineering. They required a long-term commitment to parts, dealer service, technical updates, and regulatory compliance across dozens of global markets. Every model had to be tested in different soil types, temperature ranges, and fuel standards. And once in the field, It needed to run for decades, not just years. The agricultural business was built on relationships and reliability. But it wasn't built for speed. Profits came slowly, and margins were always thin. Ford, by contrast, was shifting toward faster-moving segments. Passenger vehicles, commercial trucks, and consumer finance were showing stronger returns with far less logistical drag. A truck rolling off a line in Detroit could be sold anywhere in the world, with only minor changes. A diesel tractor built for the Midwest couldn't run the same way in Australia, Brazil, or Northern Europe without a complex web of adaptation. That kind of support structure demanded constant reinvestment, and Ford's leadership had begun to view that reinvestment as a sunk cost, one that no longer aligned with its growth targets. This wasn't about weakness, it was a strategy. Ford chose to reallocate its resources, moving away from low-margin industries like farm machinery and instead building dominance in areas with global scalability. In that sense, tractors weren't abandoned, they were traded for reach. But even after the exit, the engineering never stopped working. Much of the research and development behind Ford's final tractor lines, including diesel platforms in the 4,000 cubic centimeters to 6.6 liters, or roughly 244 to 401 cubic inches range, continued to influence New Holland designs well into the 21st century. The hydraulic layouts, drivetrains, and powertrain concepts that had made Ford tractors stand out were quietly folded into CNH Industrial's global product lines. Ford's name may have disappeared from the decals, but the DNA stayed behind, powering machines under new colors, new logos, and new leadership. And while it may never return to the fields that built its legacy, Ford's exit wasn't a retreat into silence. It was a transformation, the kind only a company with global ambition could afford to make. Ford may have left the tractor business, but its legacy never left the land. Got memories of a Ford that pulled more than just implements? Share them below, like the video if you learned something new, and subscribe for more.